Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to this session of the Working Group on Scaling Up in Fragile States, which is part of a larger community of practice on scaling up development outcomes. Today, we are delighted to have two of our members from the OECD presenting. Harsh Desai is going to be leading the presentation, and Jonathan Marley will be actively engaged in the Q&A around this. And what they're going to do is essentially give us a sneak peek into one of the flagship reports that the OECD does every 2 years, which is the States of Fragility report. Jonathan leads the team coordinating this effort, and Harsh is one of the leading brain trusts on data analytics, strategy, and approach. So it's wonderful to have them presenting today to give a preview on the framing, the thinking, the directions as a way for us as a working group to give inputs on this, and then in particular to think about how scaling approaches in fragile places can benefit from this kind of analysis, how we can inform this kind of analysis, and then what the implications are for working in these harder places with this kind of rounding out about the networks that this kind of report creates, the information flows, the diagnostics. I have to say, having worked in this space for 20 years and having closely watched and been a part of some of the conversations on this work, that the OECD's work on fragile states really has an outsized influence in the industry. This States of Fragility report is extremely important for thinking about future directions. In 2016, the OECD redefined fragility in terms of resilience, and this framework and these reports are really advancing this kind of approach. And so we've seen that now happening across a lot of other partner organizations and multilaterals as well. And so this really is a critical report. It's a great team working on it, and it's great to have everyone here. Because we're a small but mighty group today, I think it'd be great for us to just go around and briefly say our names and where we're from, what institutions we're from, and then we'll open it up to Harsh to give us the presentation, after which time my co-chair, Rob Chase, will moderate a Q&A and then do some closing remarks as well. So if I can start, Rob, with you for an introduction, and then we'll go around.
Great. I'm Rob Chase. I am, as Jonathan said, I am the co-chair of this group, and really looking forward to hearing what Harsh and what you have to say and what the OECD is thinking about, because it does influence. I work at the World Bank in my day job and cover the Horn of Africa, so these issues are foremost in my mind. So Jonathan, I'm not quite sure how to organize the calling on people. So if you can just call folks out, that would be
sure.
great.
I'll go down my list in the order that they appear. So Alistair, please.
Yeah, I'm Alistair McKechnie, ODI, which is London based, and I've been an avid watcher of these OECD reports for many years, and many of the people we're working with are wrestling with this question of what is fragility and how do you measure it. And I think the OECD is actually one of at the forefront of this, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you. April.
Hi, everyone. My name is April Knox. I am a policy manager at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL, based out of MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There I manage our work on crime, violence, and conflict, but very excited to hear the presentation today from Harsh and Jonathan, and really excited about the work that you all are doing to kind of rethink the various aspects of fragility and how we classify fragility. So looking forward to it.
Larry.
Larry Cooley. I'm president emeritus of a firm here in Washington, D.C. called Management Systems International. And with my friend and colleague, Johannes, Lynn was responsible for setting up this community of practice some years ago. Maybe relevant to today's conversation, Jonathan and I wrote a paper on scaling up in fragile states, and I've chaired or facilitated for the last 3 years the annual learning forum on fragility and resilience in South Sudan.
Thanks, Larry. Sabine.
Hi, I'm Sabine Fezzola. I'm from the Education Development Center, and I'm here on behalf of my colleague Nancy Wallace, but I'm keenly interested in the topic. At EDC, I helped to manage the Education and Crisis and Conflict Network, and we did some work with OECD on that realm, particularly with respect to resilience, and really excited to hear about the latest and greatest here. Thank you for having me.
And Julie.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry, Jonathan, I can't hear very well. So yeah, Julie Howard. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I work on global food security issues, but particular interest in food security in conflict-affected countries. I wrote a paper with a colleague a couple of years ago on risk and resilience, scaling up food security initiatives in northern Nigeria. Primarily interested in U.S. policy. So, thank you.
Great. And Cornelia.
Yes, hello everyone. Cornelia Yanka, also Education Development Center. I lead EDC's Crisis, Conflict, and Violence team and previously led USAID's Education and Crisis and Conflict Network. My particular interest is thinking about the resilience, this term that seems to be growing in popularity within the education sphere, particularly related to community and institutions. And I think that relates very much to scaling up. And so I'm interested in seeing how you're looking at that. Thank you.
Great. And Pallavi.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Pallavi Roy. I'm a lecturer senior lecturer, in international economics at SOAS, University of London, also London-based, and also co-PI of 2 FCDO-funded projects, one which works on anti-corruption evidence, mainly in Nigeria, Tanzania, and Bangladesh, but also a lot of other developing contexts, and also an FCDO-funded program on inclusive development in Nepal. And it's good to see that Nepal seems to have jumped out of this list this year. It will be interesting to see what the criteria were for that, and our work in a very adverse context of corruption does intersect with fragility. So really looking forward to hearing what Harsh and Jonathan have to say. Thanks.
Great. And Ruth.
Hello, I'm Ruth Simmons from ExpandNet, and I'm in the health working group of the Community of Practice. But I feel that fragility applies to all of the settings that we're working with, and there's much to be learned. And that's why I'm very, very eager to hear your presentation, Harsh.
And Leonard.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm walking around in Mexico City. I'm changing my routine to do more walking in the morning, but then it turns out to be late for this kind of meeting. But I'm almost home. So my name is Leonard. I work for the CGIR based in Mexico City, as I said. My position is seconded through GIZ, so I have kind of two hats, and I'm co-chairing the agricultural working group with Julie and many others. We actually have a bench, I think, not a chair, but a bench. Okay, thanks.
And then we'll go to our friends at the OECD, Jonathan Marley.
Hi, Jonathan, and I forgive the background noise. I'm on a chair, not a bench. But good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Jonathan Marley. I work on the States of Fragility team with Harsh. My background is in security, and in addition to the work on the framework, I'm also currently researching financing for security sector reform. Thank you.
Great. And Violetta, welcome.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Violetta Stasiuk, and I work with Jonathan and Harsh in the States of Fragility team as a junior policy analyst. And my background is in security and East Africa.
Great. And Harsh, I will leave it to you to make the final intro and then to turn it over for the presentation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everybody. Harsh Desai here. I'm a data analyst on the States of Fragility team and very excited to be here. So if it's okay with you, Jonathan, I can go ahead and just get started. I will load up the presentation. Okay, Great. Well, I mean, thanks very much, everybody, for your enthusiasm, and it's great to see such a diversity of expertise in this room. In the lead up to this presentation, I had to do my due diligence and do some reading to make sure that I was prepared, and coincidentally, I ended up reading. Everything I came across was from everyone who is in this room. So I can tell that you are all the experts, and I'm really excited to hear from you and to hear your thoughts. So in the next 5 minutes, I'll be going through our thinking on states of fragility, both on the conceptual and technical side, and talk through the applications of our fragility framework, potentially for scaling up in fragile contexts, and especially related to issues of fragility prevention and resilience. So before I do all of that, let's talk about what I mean when I talk about fragility. There are two important components to the definition of fragility that the OECD presented back in 2015 and that we're continuing to develop going into the next States of Fragility report, which will be sometime mid-year next year. So the first is that fragility is a combination of exposure to risk and insufficient coping capacity to counteract those risks. So as you all know, risks manifest themselves differently at different times, with some happening suddenly and the others building up over a long time. At the other end are coping capacities, what we refer to as resilience, that provide entry points to counteract these risks. So fragility is a dynamic balancing act between various risks and coping capacities. And I think it's important especially to highlight these coping capacities because they provide an avenue for innovation, adaptation, and ultimately scaling up to address compound risks. So the second component of this definition is that fragility is multidimensional and universal, happening in a spectrum of intensity across 5 dimensions. The economic, the environmental, the political, the security, and the societal. And in the next report, we will be introducing a 6th dimension of fragility, which we're calling the human dimension, measuring human capital outcomes and progress. So this multidimensionality is another element that offers a comprehensive picture to understand the various vulnerabilities that a country is facing and how they may affect pathways, drivers, and spaces that affect scaling up. So I won't bore you with the methodological details, but ultimately we use 45 quantitative indicators over these 5 dimensions, so about 8 to 12 indicators per dimension, to arrive at our fragility framework that you can see here, that highlights the severity of fragility across each dimension for all 57 of our fragile contexts as of the States of Fragility 2020 report. So you can see a fair bit of variation here across dimensions, which is sort of the point of our methodology. It's to recognize that fragile states are not homogeneous and that they can't be easily compared or even ranked. So this kind of framework allows you to see where the opportunities may exist for scaling within a particular dimension, and also highlights elements that are overlooked when thinking about scaling, such as the role of social cohesion and capital, which many of you might be familiar with from Jonathan's work on this topic, especially for States of Fragility 2018. So understanding this multidimensionality is also important because it can allow you to bring diverse actors to the same table to facilitate scaling up through complementary, coordinated, and cohesive approaches, what we call the humanitarian development and peace nexus that I'll get into a little bit later. And particularly, we feel that there's an opportunity to bring security actors to the table as part of this conversation. Finally, when looking at the framework, you can compare countries that have similar fragility profiles, so similar shading in each dimension, which can also help with scaling up as you can look to apply lessons from one country to another, while also recognizing inevitably that every country is different and that some level of adaptation will be required. So let's get into kind of some of the innovations of the last States of Fragility report. The fragility framework measures fragility at the country level. And part of the reason for that is due to the constraints of available data and methodologies, with the other reason being very simple and quite political, that OECD donors want to know which countries are fragile and where they should prioritize their official defined to borders, and it doesn't happen uniformly within countries. So part of scaling up strategy successfully is understanding the broader picture beyond national borders. And so for the first time, we looked to measure fragility at the regional, the sub-regional, and the subnational level. So there are data constraints to increasing the scope of this type of analysis. I'm not sure the extent to which we can do this on a global basis, but this was really meant to be a proof of concept and a first step. Our point is that for scaling, it's obviously important to recognize that each of these different levels, including the national, affect each other, and nothing happens in a vacuum, which is why things like conflict sensitivity is so important. So for example, in the case of subnational fragility, many of these subnational events that you're seeing are actually being shaped by national level processes and political settlements that are being constantly negotiated and changing over time. So I think it's important to recognize that variation, both across the dimensions of fragility, across time, and also across different geographic levels. So in my last slide, another application of our thinking in the fragility framework is on scaling to inform national strategies for conflict prevention and peace building. And this will likely be the topic of a paper that we'll be preparing for next year and in the lead up to the next States of Fragility report. So I think what we're wondering is, what is unique about prevention and peace building that might prohibit scaling up? And conversely, what is conducive to peace building that facilitates the scaling up of different approaches? So our approach to prevention, which we set out in the last report, recognizes the centrality of a risk and resilience approach. And we feel that the fragility framework can kind of facilitate that kind of approach by looking at different vulnerabilities at different times. This approach involves a parallel strategy for reducing risks before they escalate, and then addressing the impact of risks that inevitably occur. And our argument is that this needs to be part of an integrated approach with humanitarian and development activities. That is really the thesis underlying the humanitarian development and peace nexus that is so critical in fragile states. It's really about prevention always, development when possible, and humanitarian action when necessary, all in an effort to end need. And it's important to recognize that this constellation of actors are all working, well, not necessarily together, but they're working in the same space. And so when you're thinking about scaling up, you need to think about that constellation. Other questions we're also considering, and we'd be keen for your reflections, is, how can this security development nexus specifically inform scaling up approaches? So what types of lessons or experiences are there that we can learn from? And then further down the line, we want to know, what are the delivery mechanisms to inform scaling, especially when it comes to security and prevention and peace building. So I'll stop there, but we're really keen on your reflections, both from the perspective of how we are thinking about fragility and the boundaries of defining it. And then secondly, in this kind of prevention and resilience space that we're looking to really push as we head to the next States of Fragility report. So thanks again, and over to you for any questions or reflections. Really looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Harsh. Over to Rob to help moderate some discussion.
Great, Harsh. Thank you. Really interesting, and I will at some point abuse the rights of the chair to ask a couple of questions, and just to give you the prelude on that. As a person who has spent a lot of my time working on fragility, but looking at human capital, I'm really interested in when you talk about OECD bringing in the human capital as a sixth dimension. Is that as much on the both exposure and capacity to handle? I think all of these dimensions are obviously on both, but would love to chat with you either in this setting or more broadly about that new direction. I'd like to open up the field, and I think the easiest way to do this is if people are able to raise their hand, and I can then just choose people from that in the order in which they do that. So I just raise my hand with the little button on Teams, and if anybody would like to start with a few questions, and Harsh will gather 2 or 3 questions perhaps, and then have you respond. And we don't want it to be too seminar focused. It can be a freewheeling conversation, but let's get it started with a couple of questions from the field if anyone has them. Anyone? So I thought I first saw Leonard, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm back home again. So thank you. Now for me this is a little bit of a new topic. So maybe my question is a bit off. But when I think of fragile states, I think about countries that also have this have like development aid, but also they have this humanitarian support or how do you call it, emergency aid, and that of course is like in agriculture. This is kind of like they're giving out free seeds or they're giving out this for free, and they're basically undermining the whole sustainability element of what we're trying to do. I'm wondering, how does that play out in those fragile states? It must be much stronger, and how that affects scaling or sustainable scaling. Let's put it this way. Over. You're muted, Robert.
Sorry about that. You'd think after 15 months. So Pallavi, then Larry.
Hi, thanks, Harsh. Lots of food for thought. It's just 2 slides, but there's already a swoosh of questions going through my head. So a bit of a sort of comment and a bit of a question and a little bit of a prodding. I really liked how you also in the link that you send the HDP nexus, the humanitarian, the peace and development. And given that I am a development and political economist, I'd like to unpack the development aspect of it more. The countries that we see, straddle Kenya and Bangladesh, where you really do have developmental, and I mean really productive sector possibilities as compared to a South Sudan or a Somalia. So we're really looking at straddling a spectrum here. How, in that sense, how would you define development for a Bangladesh or a Kenya or even a Tanzania as compared to the other slightly more conflict-ridden countries? That's the question. But I think the sort of complementarity that I see with our approach and the link to scaling is whichever context that you look at, and we work, for instance, in a context like Nigeria, even in the extractive sector or in the electricity sector, it's actually possible to start small in a sort of productive oriented sort of policy design, whether it's to improve electricity generation through renewables, etc., and then start scaling up, which does, it's more than a tick box exercise of just doing some development and funding aid, funneling aid into these sectors. So that's my comment, and the question was on the sort of Bangladesh, Kenya versus South Sudan kind of spectrum. Thank you. Over and out from me.
Thanks, Pallavi. And at risk of overwhelming the first set of conversations, Larry, you want to round out, and then we'll have Harsh and Jonathan if they'd like to come back.
Sure.
And then
thanks.
I did note I noted 2 other hands, but we'll wait for next round on those.
Thank you guys for presenting the information and also for the work that you're doing on it. I have a question from my perspective. The analysis of fragility is useful only to the extent it informs our action about fragility, and I'm worried and chastened on the action side. And in particular, these 3 different communities that you're describing in the nexus, and that I would use the same terminology for, I think have particular difficulty talking to each other. It's easier to create the conversation at the country level than it is among the third-party interveners. And I'm wondering what your experience has been using the diagnostic or anything else for that matter as a way of promoting constructive engagement across those? Can you even get the same people, the respective people to the table at the same time? And has it been your experience that anything concrete comes out of that? Because I've convened, I can't tell you how many of these sessions in particular countries or sometimes globally about this, and I can get people to participate in the conversation, but in all honesty, it goes very flat after that in terms of the follow-up action. It's like I'm from Mars and you're from Venus on this, and people seem to appreciate a little bit of understanding of the other perspective, but it's not enough to create an imperative for people to actually come together. My personal feeling at the moment is that we're better off trying to drive that convergence at the country level among the host country actors, and then have it become more of an imperative for the external parties than to try to organize it externally and then import it.
Thanks, Larry. Harsh, and I will weigh in perhaps later on my personal experience of last year on that very issue. But Harsh, over to you, or Jonathan, as you guys see fit.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I can start, and then Jonathan can also come in afterwards. These are really difficult questions, so I'll do my best. But okay, just to start from the top with your question on the human capital dimension, Rob, that's a great one. We wanted to incorporate this dimension after getting some feedback from the donors and from other folks about the importance of talking about the basic fundamental building blocks of development in many of these countries, which is health and education. I think that with the conversations around the World Bank's Human Capital Index, the continuing refinement of the UNDP's Human Development Index to also look at ecological risks, we thought that this was really opportune to start thinking about what a sixth dimension would look like, especially as a way, again, to bring more folks to the table and talking about these things. So I think development actors are obviously concerned about health and education, but I think humanitarian actors are also very much in these spaces. And so this might be, we thought it would be a way to kind of bring humanitarian actors into the dialogue. And then lastly, and this was perhaps not, well, this was not planned at all, obviously, but with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that highlighted the importance of talking about health and education and the learning crisis as well. So I think those sorts of things all came together. I'm happy to share with you the background paper that my colleague Kathleen Fourchon wrote on this topic, and then the list of indicators that we're thinking of. So we're looking to continuing to refine what this dimension will look like right up until the next report. And so it'd be great to have a conversation with you and any other folks in the room, not just about the human dimension, but I feel like once we decided to open that can of worms, we needed to revisit every other indicator and every other dimension, and that's what we're doing. On Leonard, your question about kind of development and humanitarian support and what it looks like and what it means for scaling, that's a great question, and I think also ties into some of Pallavi's points. I think, so the biggest misconception is that humanitarian action or humanitarian ODA is the biggest slice of ODA in fragile states. Actually, development support is the biggest slice, although we are seeing that the increase in ODA over the past 10 or so years has been driven by humanitarian support. And that's concerning, right? I mean, it's concerning because you're seeing bloated humanitarian budgets, you're seeing a bureaucracy that really can't, that sort of just stays there and does what development actors are supposed to do. And that's really where these conversation about the nexus comes in, is to kind of make sure that everyone is sort of doing what they're supposed to do and nothing more. And so when it comes to the humanitarian actors, yeah, I think we need to have a serious conversation about their role in sort of staying and kind of prolonging their stay in crisis settings. And what's unfortunate is, well, maybe not unfortunate, that's the wrong word. What's interesting is that you see these humanitarian actors really be the main sources of data and coordination in a lot of these crisis settings. So there is something very significant to say about scaling. I don't know the answer, but I think it starts with having a conversation about the different roles and responsibilities among these actors and how, you know, development actors can kind of come back into the scene and allow for this kind of sustainable transitions over time. At the same time, I mean, there are some, you know, humanitarian programs that could be scaled, that have the potential to be scaled, especially in the social protection sphere. And this also, sorry, gets into the discussion about the human capital dimension, because there is an element of investments in social protection that are a coping capacity to human capital development that we also want to make sure to integrate. Pallavi, great points about the developmental possibilities and how you would kind of go about defining development. I don't have the right answer, but I think with Bangladesh, Kenya, and South Sudan, it's important to realize, and I think the novelty in the framework is that you can identify different vulnerabilities across the dimensions, and that sort of opens up different definitions of what development actually means, and also what it means to invest in prevention and resilience at different times based on what a particular country is going through. So I think that's the kind of nuance that we're trying to add to the conversation. Before that, it was very much about ranking countries that really had no business being ranked. And just to be very explicit, the fragility framework, the reason we call it a framework is because we don't want to call it an index so that we're not ranking countries. And that visualization is like very clearly meant for you to not think of it as a ranking. So that's really where we're going there. And yeah, Larry, that's a great question. I mean, we are earnestly trying to get the security actors at the table. I think that was really what we wanted to do with the States of Fragility 2020 report and defining the role of security actors and emphasizing to our members that security actors have a disproportionate role to play, particularly in countries where, you know, you have peacekeeping missions where really it's the peacekeeping mission that's doing everything. So I think you're absolutely right that there's sort of a disconnect there, and I would say two things. One is that I think the last point you made about driving engagement at the country level is paramount. It really has to be led by the national actors, by the government within this framework in bringing the rest of the actors into the table. And obviously that's hard in these fragile states because of the lack of government capacity. But I also think this is where there's potential for country platforms. And I know Jonathan has done a lot of great work on this, but really it's the country platforms where the government is at the center, setting the priorities, telling the international partners what it needs, and then the partners then using that as a mechanism to fund those different priorities. It might sound a bit naive, but I think there's definitely potential in the cases of Somalia and in other countries. And I think the second thing just to say is we've kind of broached the topic of having these diagnostics be deployed at the country level. Donors such as Belgium and Denmark have done this successfully in sort of like a workshop style where they brought actors into the same room with civil society organizations and the government as an opportunity to identify vulnerabilities and set priorities. And we also did this for the DRC, where we led a workshop for the formation of collective outcomes, and the fragility framework, the analysis at the country level was sort of a technical input. I can't say that we had security actors in the room at that discussion, but I think that's really the next step. Sorry, so yeah, I hope that answered your questions. Go ahead.
Harsh, great. Nice sort of continuation of a conversation. Alistair, you had your hand up, and if others would like to join in, please put your hands up, and then we can keep the conversation going. Alistair.
Okay, thank you. I thought this was really interesting, and a number of questions, comments arose in my mind as you spoke. I mean, one is that we're talking about getting to scale. One of the biggest impacts we could all have collectively is preventing conflict, because conflict prevented has enormous results, impacts, and as someone says, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, or whatever the proverb is. But one of the questions I have is that often you find that countries that appear to be doing well, that aren't considered necessarily to be fragile, suddenly fall apart in a nasty war, and that raises questions about are we measuring the right things? Are the indicators the right ones? Are we being too technocratic? For example, because I could see one of the real benefits, one of the uses of these indicators is actually as a kind of screening out, which countries are vulnerable to conflict, and then how can their partners work with them to try and prevent war. And that brings me to, what are we going to measure? I mean, you mentioned coping capacity, which is great, but if you drill down and see what is that, are there things that are inherently difficult to measure, like institutional quality, the legitimacy of the state, of whether there are non-Western models of governance that are stable, at least a short term? Are you, as a country, in a sort of short-term partial equilibrium that's inherently unstable? These kinds of questions. What is the distribution of economic rents? Indeed, how do distributional issues generally matter? No, I think you pick up some of that, and I also understand the difficulty of coming up with measurements that are comparable across countries. But some comment on whether we're measuring the right things. And someone mentioned COVID, and if you look at the way in which countries responded to the COVID crisis, and I'm looking more at Western countries, but not exclusively, or shall I say, in industrialized, developed countries, not necessarily Western ones. You see a large difference in the you'd say their coping capacity or their ability to respond. And then when you sort of drill down and ask the question, why did some countries do much better than others? What were the factors? What does this tell us about fragility? And this finally brings me to my last question, which I know is difficult for essentially technocrats to answer. But I think you did mention that fragility is a universal concept. I mean, shouldn't the OECD countries really be ranking themselves on their own fragility indicators, and also some of the other countries that aren't on the list? Because countries that are called fragile states, there's a kind of neo-colonial attitude inherent in this. And I think if all the countries were to actually be evaluated on a consistent basis on fragility, differences explained and so on, it would add enormously to the credibility of your excellent work. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alistair. I really I align with a lot of what the questions you bring up, particularly about whether or not the OECD countries themselves should be recognizing their own fragilities, as the past year has shown, on not just health, but in some cases political and financial dimensions. But we don't necessarily need to go there. But part of what, I mean, I have a thought or a point that I want to put out there, just as much for others to respond to. And Harsh, this doesn't need to be just at you. It's as lots of people who might want to come in. I was thinking about Larry's comment and have been reflecting on my own experience of the last year about working closely with humanitarian actors. For the record, I manage social protection for East Africa for the World Bank, and we have done a very large amount of new activity in this last year, as every country in East Africa has said we really need to expand our social protection systems. And all of that work has meant we've been needing to interact very closely with humanitarian actors. And there's the piece that makes, Larry, that conversation that I think is so necessary, that relates to the financing flows. Yes, where you get your money in some ways determines the degree to which you need or would like to chat with other groups in some ways. And so if there's a financing stream for humanitarian actors, those humanitarian actors feel as if they don't really need to have that conversation. And likewise, if the World Bank is financing only government actors, and this is a blind spot for us, that means we don't feel the need to talk to NGOs and CSOs as much. And so I think that thinking about the way that financing, particularly in fragile settings, makes it difficult for those conversations across security, development, and humanitarian actors operates, I think is something that's valuable. And I bring this up because OECD is such a good tracker, as it were, of the data on the development assistance writ large. And although I don't know much about the OECD's work with regard to tracking security issues, Larry, I knew I could get your hand up on this one. So you had something you wanted to bring in response to that?
I do, mostly to kind of underline what you were saying is that I think an important area for our community, is particularly for this working group. And if you, having myself touched this in several places, way back when the US reorganized the national security strategy to focus on defense, diplomacy, and development, I got the unenviable job of being the facilitator for a lot of these military, humanitarian, diplomatic, and development groups that came together trying to say, well, what does that mean in practice for us? And I think what you say, Rob, about the funding streams is very important. But building on that are a bunch of other things. For example, we even talked about things like the doctrine of when and how to intervene in something and how that differs across these groups. And the vocabulary is hugely different in terms of how they talk about things that you could translate into the other language, but you'd actually need a translator to do it because neither seems to speak each other's language very well. And so I think there's not only a ton to be understood here, I think there's a ton of work to be done on this. And I think it's very important because when people get out of their institutional roles, they understand it very clearly. I mean, if you have a bunch of I hazard a guess Somalis, I'll talk about South Sudanese in a room, this is not a hard thing for people to understand. They completely understand how these things interact, the long term, the short term, the security and the developmental and the humanitarian. In fact, it's ridiculous to them to think that they don't interact. But as soon as we go to the official development actors on this, we run into a problem. And I think this is a sense where it's kind of that old Pogo cartoon about the problem's us in significant measure on this. So I feel like as a global community of practice, the scaling lens, maybe I'm the kid with a hammer on this, but the scaling lens seems to be a very practical way into this problem, to just sort of say, what would it take to deliver outcomes sustainably at scale? Practically, what would it take to do that? And how do you take on some of these different coping mechanisms as part of the sustainable part of that conversation? That was in a tiny way what Jonathan and I were trying to do in the paper we started, and trying to highlight the way social capital functions in that. But that's not the only way to come at it. There are several, and I would really encourage this group, to the extent we can, for example, stay on this topic for several sessions and try to figure out something concretely to put forward and to debate among ourselves that we might then be able to advocate with third parties. I think we'd be doing a real service.
Thanks, Larry. I noted in order Jonathan and then Cornelia, Jonathan Marley, Cornelia, then Jonathan Papadopoulos. And also, if folks aren't keeping track of it, there's also a couple of comments that Leonard and Pallavi have put into the chat. And actually, Leonard, I quickly wanted to I'm keen, if you are interested, to have you expand a bit on your points about the examples of Ethiopia and Tigray. They're obviously top of mind, but want to hear what specifically you were referring to. But let's go Jonathan, Cornelia, then the other Jonathan, and Leonard, if you either want to speak or write in the chat to elaborate, that'd be great. So Jonathan Marley.
Thank you. I won't cover all of the questions, because I know Harsh is better placed to pick up on some of them. But one point, or a few points I will make based on the experience we've had going through the review process over the last 6 months. One is a deficit of awareness between security and development actors. And there is we've met very impressive people, very knowledgeable within their domains, but their awareness of what's happening around them within a fragile context is often very limited. That can come down to questions of platforms, which Jonathan, of course, has discussed in great detail, but it also can come down to a culture within the organization and a willingness to go and find out what else is happening around them, whether that's donor activity or whether it's national activity. On the donor side, and this links into the very last point about some of the financial tensions we're seeing, and Harsh can speak to the data, but on a kind of a cultural sensitivity level, we've noticed that there is a particular sensitivity between conversations on resilience and conversations on conflict prevention. And actually, there are people in the development community who will draw very clear distinctions between what is conflict prevention and what is resilience. When in fact, when we apply the framework within a given context, what we see are significant overlaps. And I would argue it's impossible to decide where certain ideas of resilience stop and certain ideas of conflict prevention start. But that is a feature of the engagement we've seen as well. So again, it is another piece of the puzzle to be unraveled. What I would say on the kind of security side, and come back to the point about, analysis is only as good as the actions it informs. So I have experience of applying the framework within a security setting. I mean, one of the things, if you're working with NATO countries, working with the EU, I mean, they have systems that are designed to allow a development and a humanitarian voice to come to the table. What is noticeable is how often that chair is left empty. What we've been able to do with the States of Fragility work is to use it as a key reference document for a step 0, step 1 analysis within the NATO context, for example. And that has proved very useful for kind of setting out points on across the nexus that security actors don't necessarily think of immediately, but it's a means to keeping it on the agenda. So we see potential in that. Only this week we've been talking to NATO. We are working, we have had more receptivity in some parts of the EU than others, but again, we see the potential there. So I think there is, we see the framework potentially as a means of of addressing some of these linguistic issues that we encounter when it comes to different pillars' understandings of what they're doing. I would also make a point on, related to that, on the application side, particularly at country level. There are so many different structures implied. Harsh mentioned peacekeeping. We've seen various development coordination platforms, various national level endeavors, whether it's through government or special entities that have been set up, such as in Somalia. And one of the things I'm beginning to wonder about this is actually, when we talk about scaling up, to what extent are we talking about a network of networks? And actually, is there almost a horizontal approach to this that could enable some of the scaling up points that you're talking about? And I'd be keen to see if that's possible. And it kind of links back to my point about awareness and about if people have that built into their approach from the start, and that there is that kind of broad appreciation, then actually networks can emerge that can provide entry points for scaling up and from that kind of shared consensus. So I wonder if there, and again, we would argue that the kind of analytical foundation that we can present through the framework might enable that kind of picture to emerge. And the final point I'll make is on the point of classification. This is something that we are very, as a team, we're very aware of. That we have at the moment a situation where we categorize states as fragile, extremely fragile, or non-fragile, and we're particularly uncomfortable with the non-fragile part of it. I think if one thing that we've seen over the last 18 months with COVID is that every state is fragile to some degree, and therefore, and I think there is more of a willingness now to have that conversation because of the COVID experience, and that is something that we're keen to explore. I think, as Harsh mentioned at the start, our coverage is extensive. We do cover 175 states, and therefore we are planning with the next report to go beyond those that are most fragile and most in need, to explore some of the conversations, whether it's at a regional basis or whether it's at a thematic basis, that some of the stories that are emerging from states that won't figure on the 57 most fragile, but nonetheless are worthy of attention. So we are trying to address that weakness that in terms of classification that we see. So I hope I've picked up some points there, but I'm happy to hand back to the floor. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm just playing my time management role and seeing, at least officially, we've got 7 minutes left in this setting. I think people could stay on longer, but just out of respect for those who are here, we'd like to try to wrap it up officially at 11. Cornelia, you wanted to speak. Jonathan, you wanted to speak, and then I wanted to give Alistair, your hand's still up. Is that a new question? Okay, so why don't we go Cornelia, Jonathan, Alistair, and then give last word to Harsh, and that should wrap us up around the end of the hour. So Cornelia, over to you.
Yes, thank you. This comment from an education standpoint follows probably best on the heels of Larry's observations as a comment and a question. My comment is, because EDC works in an education space, and because we are a development actor that is also and often drawn into real humanitarian situations, I'm listening to your description of the fragility work, and I'm thinking about the scaling up piece, because from an education standpoint, scaling up does become quite relevant and important. Where I went at first is I focused on the different dimensions, and education has the benefit and the unfortunate situation that we don't fit neatly into any one of these dimensions, in the sense that education is impacted by all of these dimensions. And so really, when we're thinking about scaling up, when we're thinking about planning and implementing an education program, we have to consider all of them. So my question, maybe for Harsh, I don't know, is, when you were doing the background papers and in assembling this data, is there anything that sort of rose to a higher level for you about the countries? Are there certain combinations of dimensions that lend themselves well or better to different sorts of development or scaling up than others? And again, from the education standpoint, I'm wondering what that profile would look like. How can we use this tool to help us have a better sense of what our areas of emphasis should be? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Cornelia. Jonathan, then Alistair, then last word to Harsh. And just to let people know that there is a nice and substantive conversation going on the chat as well, that people may want to look at, respond to, engage on. But Jonathan, to you, then Alistair, then Harsh.
Great. I just wanted to lift out a few points that Harsh was making and try and connect it to others, in the sense of the fact that it helps us really orient the scaling challenge. And the one is to say that the concept of resilience, this fragility to resilience approach, is quite different than the typical approach to resilience that was really siloed in sectors, right? Like climate change and food security. And it's really involved in looking at two levels of resilience, right? The one is the resilience of the political settlements and the institutions that they create in a particular place to shocks and stress, violent or challengers, new economic, political challengers, and how well can those institutions and settlements adapt as opposed to falling apart. The other piece of resilience then is to say, in any given political settlement and set of institutions, people will be excluded from that. And how do you boost the resilience of those vulnerable groups that are excluded from access to safety nets, services, markets, and opportunities? So the challenge, what the OECD has done is really rounded it up to say this is a higher order challenge of moving from fragility to resilience. That's not just about one set of projects in one particular sector. So I think that's very important. The question then becomes, how do you then address complex interacting risks in a place like Ethiopia, where you're not just looking at the crisis or a conflict in one area, you're looking at famine and food security issues in another, you're looking at high unemployment, potentially chronic hunger, you're looking at high sovereign debt risks, political legitimacy issues, all of these pieces. And one of the ways that I've liked that the OECD has done in the last report and the Fit for Fragility paper is to talk about these country platforms, which we've been talking about in separate settings for a while, to say that there needs to be some kind of collective action within the aid community, working with governments and others to really figure out how do we move forward in some of these spaces, right? And in many of these country platforms over the last 20 years, you've had a space for security sector reform discussions, you've had a space for economy discussions, governance, service delivery, etc. Now, when you have that, but you also have an acute understanding of the political settlement and the real risks that are facing the country because of the way that the settlement is structured, the institutions are structured, who's vulnerable, then you really have something that you didn't have before in development or in humanitarian practice, which is namely a shift to thinking about resilience in a more sophisticated way, right? Most of humanitarian work is life-saving, life-sustaining needs. Most of development work is poverty reduction or service delivery, again, meeting needs. But the shift to resilience is looking at complex interacting risks, and then how you build a set of coping capacities, namely absorptive capacities, adaptive capacities, and transformative capacities, which can be applied to looking at these institutional political settlement issues of resilience, but also to specific vulnerable groups. And this is where the sectors come in play, right? The basic services, et cetera, et cetera. So looking at it in that level, then you can then say something like country platforms that bring multiple groups together are a huge step forward in trying to really get some collective understanding of what the risks in a particular place are and how to draw from a wide range of potential coping capacities as they appear through implementing partners, donors, government, civil society, etc. So I think that's very important. What you then get is a scaling approach that can potentially really accelerate this, right? And I always think of Afghanistan because I think you had in Afghanistan, if not the conceptual framework way back when to do some of this work, you had the raw components and the proof of concept, right? You had a country platform that's gone through multiple iterations, the Joint Coordination Monitoring Board, and you had 4 experiments to go to scale in really key areas, right? 2 of which succeeded, 2 of which didn't. The energy and education one didn't, but the microfinance national solidarity program and the basic package on health services really rapidly scaled in a period of less than a year. And the question that Larry and I posed and the kind of challenge we posed in the paper we did on scaling of fragile states.
Jonathan, I'm
time.
Run towards the end and wanted to have Alistair speak and then Harsh speak. So if you could wrap
Yeah,
up.
I'm just on that last piece about the question is those large scale efforts in Afghanistan reach a lot of people and hit a lot of development outcome goals. But what could be done if you're actually taking a resilience approach, bringing in human and social capital approaches and really trying to build coping capacities as part of that. So I think that's where the discussion needs to go in many ways from here. Thank you.
No, that's great. Alistair, I have abused the 11 o'clock deadline, but if you wanted to throw a quick point in, that'd be great, and then we'll give the final word to Harsh.
No, this is really quick. I'm glad someone mentioned, Jonathan mentioned Afghanistan, which of course is dear to my heart as I was involved way back then, including meetings, regular meetings with NATO ministers on the defense side as well as development and finance. And I think this really illustrates the point that the problem is not just necessarily talking together, it's getting policy coherence. And that's what's really lacking in almost all OECD country governments. China arguably has been able to pull together coherence and in the sense of getting all state and other instruments under the government's control to work in harmony. And this competition may actually promote more coherence on the OECD side, though I haven't seen much evidence of it so far. And I think this framework has the opportunity to help bring that coherence, because one of the problems I've noticed is that problems often of fragility get securitized. In other words, governments immediately go towards a security sector approach rather than a coherent whole of government approach. And I think the framework is one step forward. I think the other one where the OECD might help is on the funding side, because if it was actually knew how much money was being spent on the security side, on the diplomatic side to try and prevent conflict, I think it would be very revealing, because I think it would show that the security expenditures dominate them, but there are issues of how you measure those. And I think that would be one step forward in trying to come up with a much more coherent approach to addressing the problems of fragility and conflict prevention. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alistair. So Harsh, I'm going to give you last word. And before I do that, well, thank you for coming, and thank you for pulling together a great conversation. Some people may have to drop off, but I really want to express appreciation. But please, over to you for last words.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, this has been a fascinating conversation with a lot of great questions. And I think both of the Jonathans synthesized the points really well towards the end. So all that I will add is just to say that I think you asked some fantastic questions here that just give me some ideas and fodder for future work. For example, Cornelia, your question about the intersections between dimensions is one I can't answer right now, but that we definitely want to tackle in the next report. And similarly, Alistair, the basic question that you asked of why are some countries better than others is a fundamental one that I think we just need to take a step back and kind of have an answer to, and it's something we can look into as well. So all that is to say is I hope we can continue the conversation in this forum as well as bilaterally. That would be great. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Harsh, and we really look forward to seeing the OECD's work, but also continuing the conversation, sort of elaborations of deeper dives into some of these issues we've spoken about. Thanks everybody for joining and adding to the conversation in lots of different ways. Jonathan, leave it to you to close if there's anything else we need to add from the COP side.
Nope. Thank you very much, friends and friends at the OECD in particular. And we will get this out in recording format. And if you want to connect with Harsh or any of the team directly, let me know, and I can make that happen as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. A very interesting discussion.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you.